It's going towards the afternoon. My name is Peter Schmatz, and I'm a program manager in the Lync server team. And I will talk about, in the first part of this presentation, I'll be talking about Lync Server 2010 setup and deployment. And in the second part of the presentation, my colleague Robert Fleming will talk about upgrade and coexistence scenario. So first of all, I'd like to raise your hand if you have Lync Server 2010 deployed. Let me see the hands. All right, fantastic. Who of you have PSTN integration deployed? All right. Who of you got rid of the PBX by doing that? You're the man. Congratulations. One IP phone for you. I have some more, so if you stick around, I might have some other good questions. Okay, no, as a branch applies. I'll have some good questions to ask. All right. So, by the way, we have a couple of giveaways here, and some of them are a bit strange. So if you have a really strange question, I have some strange giveaways for you as well. I'm not mentioning that because you might run out right away. So that's why. Okay. Let's get started. So what we want to talk about in this session is just a general boring prerequisites, the software, the hardware requirements. I want to talk a little bit about the changes from the previous release or the previous releases to Lync Server 2010. I would like to give you an overview of the end-to-end experience for the setup deployment process. I will talk a little bit about the purpose of the central management server and store as far as they're concerned for the deployment pieces. We have some additional sessions later this week in which we will talk into more details about that. I will have a brief introduction into the deploy wizard, and I actually will do a demo with the topology builder. I will author a simple topology. And then Robert will be talking about coexistence and migration. Okay, the agenda. So we will talk about hardware, software. We'll talk about virtualization support, the changes in setup and deployment, the central management store, and what data is in Active Directory. I'll show you the setup components and the setup flow. There's a deployment wizard, the prepare Active Directory. I have a couple of screenshots on this. And I like to make the contrast between the UI and the PowerShell commandlets. My demo, I will be doing a simple topology using Topology Builder here on my notebook. Actually, I will run this all the way through just before I publish. Since I don't have the full equipment around, I will kind of stop short of actually publishing it. And then, as mentioned, Robert will talk about coexistence and migration. If you have time left at the end, I will talking about database setup and some other setup tasks that are optional that we can perform. Okay, hardware recommendations. So up front, I'd like to actually let this fly in here already. We have now what we call a Lync server capacity calculator, which is in essence an Excel sheet in which you can punch in your number of users, your modalities, what type of usage you anticipate. And we will give you an overview of how many servers we think you should have, what type of specs these servers have, what type of memory those servers have. So generally what we have, we put our servers in two buckets. I mean, the one is the front end and the other one is the back end. And the front end spec, the way we calculated this is we took a 80,000 user pool with 8 front ends and 1 back end. And that is our baseline. If you use all the modalities, if you have a standard usage profile for conferencing, you have PSTN integration, you basically have everything. So the key thing that you have to know here is that you have to provision for the peak requirement. And that means that there is conferences that take place on those front ends, which is the most CPU intensive and memory intensive. So therefore, we have this 16 gigabyte requirement. Now, if you look in the capacity calculator, you will actually see that on some of our other roles, like the edge or the archiving, depending on your anticipated load, you can actually get away with less memory. We don't want really to go below anything below 4 gigabyte is not recommended. So there's some, like the archiving server, for example, is perfectly happy at 8 gigabyte of memory. In terms of the requirements, yes, you have attached storage, the typical enterprise-grade storage. We would recommend you to have 2 network cards. And so this is primarily that if you have some other workloads running, some other management tools running, that you have a separate NIC that you run this through. Don't run any administrative or backup tasks through the NIC that is used for your clients because it might affect the performance. If you decide to do a backup and at the same time you home a conference on your front end, we might actually fill up your NIC and you might actually have a saturation on your NIC. We do support NIC teaming, and in some instances, if you prefer, you would have 4 NICs on your server, where one team is for the client access and the other team is for administrative access. On the backend side, we have similar specs. We have 2 CPUs with 8 cores, and we would like you to have more memory, especially if you have the 80,000 users. Again, use the capacity calculator, and you will see, you can play with the numbers, and you see that we actually use less memory on some, if you have fewer users. It is very important for us that our database is in memory on the SQL Server. This is our presence database, and that is the presence notification that you have in Lync. If this is not really snappy and fast, then you will get a stale presence, and the user experience is very bad. So, for example, somebody clicks on the icon and sees somebody green. They click to call, and then the presence updates, and it turns to away or something like that, and you're just like, hey, geez, it was just like a second ago he was there, and now he's gone. So the faster the backend here is, the better is your experience around the presence. And we have similar requirements on the attached storage. We would recommend you to have multiple spindles or multiple loons on a SAN. Here again, the log files and the data files should be separate, and so the SQL experts would know the details. Okay, Lync server virtualization. So we have an updated white paper that got released in January, I believe, or actually in February. Virtualization, we support virtualization on for all our workloads. That means audio, video, app sharing. And we support it on Standard Edition, on Enterprise Edition. However, we require that you have Windows Server 2008 R2, both on the guest and on the VM. The Hyper-V and R2, they have a specific fix that is extremely important to us that improves the NIC performance and also provides the ability to do the synthetic NIC offloading, which is extremely important for us. We support other hypervisor implementations that are certified through this server virtualization vendor program. We specifically have tested it with VMware, obviously, but we don't exclude anything specifically. Again, it's very important that you have a very good performance between your guest NIC and your host NIC. And so VMware has some technologies basically where they provide a direct access to the NICs. That's very important that this is implemented there as well. We have a survivable branch appliance that is currently an OEM appliance that is not virtualized. If you choose to, you can deploy this as a software solution, which is just a standard server with a PSTN gateway. And in that case, you can actually virtualize it as well. Here in this deck, I have a link to this updated Lync virtualization white paper. Again, take a look at this. This gives some guidance on recommendations on what type of deployment you have. This is based on some hardware manufacturers' recommendations as well, and also on some recommendations that made by the Hyper-V team. So we had that reviewed by the Hyper-V team, and they made some important comments around this. So here we have some typical guidance around the virtualization in the guest OS and on the host. What to do. What type of bottlenecks you can expect. And to give you an example, if you have a VM host with a single 1 gigabit NIC interface, and you're running 4 VMs on this one, and all of those 4 VMs are front ends. So, and you all of them running a conference, you can actually quite easily hit the limit of the 1 gigabit Ethernet. So we've seen in our load tests with large conferences, we've seen easily 250 megabit per second per front end. So again, if you look at this in a virtualized environment, make sure that you have enough bandwidth. There's some techniques you do like link aggregation with NIC teaming and those type of things on the host, and you want to utilize that. If you're the other part that is very important on your virtualized deployment is if you're using a SAN storage. The SAN storage needs to have its own network access, either an iSCSI or a fiber channel that goes directly to the storage. Again, for the backend, if your backend is on this SAN storage, make sure that it is, that you have a sufficient bandwidth and performance, so you can have the multipath I/O to the storage. Something you want to consider. Okay. I'm not talking about Lync client virtualization. We have a separate white paper. So if you look at our download page, there is one is the Lync server virtualization white paper, and there's another one that is the Lync client virtualization white paper that talks about those other things like VDI. So we keep that updated, and there's some changes coming as well. So that was just recently updated, this white paper. Okay, software requirements. Okay, this is kind of the standard Server 2008, Service Pack 2, and Server 2008 R2. We need PowerShell v2. On the SQL backend, we support SQL 2005, SQL 2008, and now finally we also support SQL 2008 R2. And so that was not supported at RTM, but now we added support. We certified that, and we made sure the performance is okay. So we added the support actually in April of this year. We have admin tools. We call them the admin tools, which is essentially this is our topology builder. And we have what we call core components, and I'll talk about those in a while in detail what they mean. These are supported on client as well, not only on server, but also on the client, including even the Vista client. It needs to be x64, and you need to have a PowerShell v2. On Active Directory side, we are supporting just the same as before, Active Directory Server 2003, 2008, 2008 R2. We don't use anything specific on those higher versions of AD. So your min bar here is 2003 for the forest and the domain level. Okay, changes in setup and deployment, and so this is kind of a comparison. What were the deployment blockers, the deployment issues we've seen, and what we have done to address those issues. So with our previous release, which means Office Communications Server 2007 and 2007 R2, our data was actually spread in multiple stores. So we had configuration data in Active Directory, we had it on a pool level in SQL, and we had it on the edge directly in WMI on the edge server. And now with this release, we have this central management database where all our configuration data is in one place. And it's easier to manage. It's our own configuration database. And one of the main issues that we've seen in with deploying our product in previous releases was that it needed a schema change. And in some customers, they could not do a schema change that quickly. They could do it once a year or something like that, and that was some major blockers because of this. So if we just wanted to enter one additional field in Active Directory, we would have to do a schema change, and then we had to schedule the schema change. And we actually felt the pain internally as well, even with our own Microsoft IT. A schema change took about a 6-week lead time, which was really, really hard for our beta deployments because we wanted to change something. We had to wait until it is deployed. We can try it out and validate it, and so it was very difficult. So moving forward, we actually will no longer. We still have a schema in Active Directory for backcompat reason, but moving forward, we actually have all our config data in our own store, so we are much more flexible in migrating them and updating it. Okay, sorry, I need to take a sip of water, which is gone. No, it's right here. Sorry. So sorry about that. So also one of the issues that we had in previous releases was that our edge server was essentially independent. It was a standalone server in the perimeter network. And so for example, if you had to change something like a federation or like adding another front-end pool, you had to go to each edge server and manually edit this correctly. And if you have a pool of edge servers, you have to make sure that you correctly updated in both of those servers. So there was a lot of room for error. You may forget things. It was hard to troubleshoot. Now, with Lync Server 2010, what we do is we replicate our configuration out to the edge. And the way we do that is we're using an HTTPS replication, a push from the internal side of the network out to the edge. And it's actually a port. A port is 4443, and you can customize that. And that enables us to basically push out to the edge and to a non-domain joined machine. And we're using our certificate for authentication that is deployed on the edge. That means also with the certificate is that for the initial deployment of the edge, you have to hand carry the first time the configuration to the edge so that we actually know that this is the edge, that is the right one. Then you need to enroll your internal certificate on the edge, and after that, the configuration is pushed down to the edge. Service user account and password expiration. So that is a big pain point in our previous release, where we had our services run as a user account. And if it's a user account, it falls under the password expiration policy. So typically every 3 months or so, the admin has to go around and update the password on all those services and restart the services. With Lync 2010, we actually moved to the network service. So we we run all our services at the network service. There's one small wrinkle, which is around the service principal name of our IIS and the access to the file share. And so out of the box here, and I have a slide at the end of the presentation to talk about that, but out of the box, actually, we use NTLM, and you don't have to configure anything. But if you want to choose Kerberos authentication for this, then we create a dummy computer account in your AD that gets a password that doesn't fall under the password expiration policies that allows you to use Kerb authentication. It's a bit of a strange config. We had that on the side. It's called under the Kerberos account configuration. You can look up in our deployment guides. It has a little bit more detail about that. I have one slide about this. I might not be able to get to it, but it's an optional config that you can do. Okay. The configuration data that is moved to our custom store. So we have a couple of roles now. One is the central management store, which in essence is a SQL database. And in this SQL database, we store XML documents. And these XML documents, they contain all the configuration data of a Lync server 2012. It contains a topology document with all the dependencies between our roles, what is configured. We have the ability to validate that with both an XSD validation as well as a business logic validation to ensure that this topology is correct. So to give you an example, if you have your edge configured as a next hop with an internal pool, we can validate that this is the next hop is really there. And vice versa, we can, if you're adding a new front-end pool, all of the edge servers will then immediately be aware of this new front-end pool. All our policies and all our configuration are now in this central management store. What is still in Active Directory is the user and the SIP URI and the user object extensions, but we will have a pointer to this policy which is no longer stored in Active Directory. That was, by the way, one of those challenges that we had in the previous releases. If we change the meeting policy, we want to add another attribute to the meeting policy. The meeting policy was in Active Directory. We had to do a schema change. And now here we have basically a pointer to a policy. And so we can basically change this policy without breaking anything of in the Active Directory schema. The central management store is a single master implementation. So we have, per deployment, we have a single master database. And there's a couple of comments on this in a moment. We have another role that's called central management server. And this is it's kind of a little bit hidden because it doesn't actually do that much. This runs on your first front-end pool that you have deployed in your Lync server deployment. And we put this component actually on one of those front ends. And only one front end, if you have multiple front ends in a pool, is actually acting as this central management server. What it does is it pushes out configuration changes that has been detected out to all the machines in your deployment. And it also does the replication via HTTPS to the edge. Now, what happens if your one front end goes down, either for scheduled maintenance or it's just has an outage? In the background, automatically we will reassign this role to another front end, and it will take care of this replication. So as a side note is if you have a large deployment, you want to put your central management server on an enterprise edition pool so you have some resiliency there. It works both on a standard edition and on an enterprise edition. And yes, we have the ability to move it later. If you start off with a standard edition deployment and you decide to move to enterprise edition, you can relocate the central management store. You can only do it through a commandlet, though. Okay, we have a replica on a replica database on each Lync server. We keep a replica database. So, and here's why. So the first thing is that we have scenarios such as the survivable branch appliance, in which we want to go into a mode where your connection to Active Directory or your connection to the rest of your corporate network is down. And so in that case, this standalone branch office appliance can restart and can have all the last known configuration locally available. That's kind of the first item, is we can run even if the master is no longer available. So that also means if your master database is down for some reason, and you don't change any config, it doesn't actually matter. The second piece of that is that we had in the past, we had this data in Active Directory. What happened here is if you have a huge distributed deployment, let's say you have one side in Singapore, the other one in Redmond, and if the server started up in Singapore and they were talking back to the root partition of Active Directory, it turned out that starting up our server took about 2 hours or 3 hours in Singapore. So we addressed this problem basically by pushing this out in a more asynchronous way to those machines. They will consume that, and when they reboot, they act on their local replica. So what it also means is that each of our Lync server machines, they have a SQL Express instance running there. So yes, it's SQL Express, but it is not remotely accessible. So this is a kind of a database component that runs on the machine. It doesn't need a lot of memory, and it's not remotely accessible. So that's also, for those of you who are concerned, we're running SQL on the edge. Yes, we do, but it's not, nobody can access it from the outside. Okay, Active Directory. So as I mentioned, we still have the Active Directory user extensions. The zip URI, the tel URI are there. We have the policy, the pointers to the policies. These are no longer pointers to Active Directory objects, but they are pointers to policies that are stored in a central management database. And we have currently in the Lync Server 2010 release a backcompat schema in there. And what is essentially what it is, it's a Office Communication Server 2007 R2 schema with a couple of extensions that we still load in there. And when you create a pool or a machine in Lync Server 2010 and you publish this, we will write the backcompat configuration into Active Directory. And what that allows is if you have previous versions or third-party integrations that run, they will automatically see the Lync Server 2010 basically by looking into AD. We might want to discontinue that in a future release, or at least make it optional. So in the current release, it is still deployed and configured each time. But eventually, over the next couple of releases, we want to phase this out. And then basically, you would have the option. Your Active Directory change would be very mild. Basically, we have just a couple of Active Directory user extensions that we have to do. We don't have to get this whole schema, carry this whole schema around as we did in previous versions. All right, central management store. Okay, so one of the key components of the setup and deployment in Lync Server 2010 is our topology document. The topology document, in essence, is an XML file that contains all the pools, the servers, fully qualified domain names, if applicable, IP addresses, and ports. And it, more importantly, it contains a dependency between those roles. So, for example, you have a front-end server that points to a back-end server that is dependent on a mediation server on an edge. It uses an archiving server. So this document spells this out and allows you to create your topology. The topology builder, that is the tool to create this topology document, has business logic built in that it allows you only to do supported things. So there's some changes that you can do. When you can do it into a topology builder, for the most part, this is a valid change, and you can do it. There's only a very few instances where you can get yourself in trouble in topology builder, and that's primarily when you have an off-ended PSTN gateway, which we currently don't allow. If it's we allow a mediation server without PSTN gateway, yes, but the other way around, if you have a PSTN gateway, you need to attach it to a mediation server, and topology builder logic will take care of that and will show you that there's a missing dependency. Okay, our local setup now, the local setup has changed dramatically, and basically what it does is it uses this topology document to install. So what it simply does is the setup is run, it looks at the topology document, and then it tries to match its FQDN and try to find it with a role that is defined in the topology document. Once this matches, it then basically starts to do some prereq checks and sees, I'm a front end, then it will run and see if IIS is installed and all those other things. And you won't be asked anything because all this configuration is already done in the topology document, and you can run that from the command line if you need to, and it will deploy your roles. What remains, though, is the certificates that you need to assign the certificates, and usually you need to request the certificates from your individual machine, mostly since you don't have exportable private keys, so you will be requesting the certificates. But other than that, your setup is essentially press one button and hit continue. Now, because of our central management store and the way we have a slight chicken and egg problem, right? So if you're deploying, if you, for example, deploy a standard edition server, you need a SQL to deploy the standard edition server, but since there's no SQL there, how do I get going here? On an enterprise edition, I require to have a full SQL in place. So here I can it works out okay. I can create my topology document, I write it to SQL, I create a service connection point in AD, and my local setup will pick it up and deploy it. However, in standard edition, we don't have this SQL until we have the server. So you will see here in standard edition on the initial splash screen, there's a little in the corner. It is a little option that says install SQL Express as a separate option. And what it would do is for a designated standard edition box, you will click that. We will drop a SQL there, and then later we make the SQL Express remotely accessible, and then the publish will write to the SQL Express, and you can bootstrap from there. You publish your topology, and then you run setup on this, and you go from there. So this is the only kind of situation where we had to do a compromise, which is around the standard edition and SQL Express deployment. Okay, all right. The Lync server components that are in deployment. So we have the core components. It's called, if you look in the programs on a server, and you'll see it's called, I think it's called Lync core components. The MSI itself kept its old name from our previous release for some reason. It's called OCS-core.msi. And you'll see in some of our blocks, we still refer to OCS core, so that's the same thing. Basically, what OCS core is, or what Lync server core is, it's a PowerShell provider and that we have, and it contains all our core components and our core DLLs. you can deploy this. So for once, this is a core, a pre-requirement for our Lync server itself. But you can also take, let's say you have a remote admin station, which is a domain joined machine, and you can install your core components there, and you can run your remote admin task. This remote admin station does not have to be configured in Topology Builder. It is a separate machine, and you would use your credentials as a user to modify Lync. We have the deployment wizard, and the deployment wizard is actually the wrapper that you launch when you run setup. So you click on setup.exe. We will go and install OCS core, and then we will bring up a deploy wizard splash screen, and I'll show you a couple of screenshots in a moment. This is your main page where you navigate and install from. We have Topology Builder. So Topology Builder is also a 64-bit only. It sits on top of Lync Server Core, but it can be installed on a separate machine. So for example, I have this installed here on my notebook, although I don't really have a deployment on the back end. So on my notebook, I have a core and I have a Topology Builder. I can actually create a topology. I can't publish it, but I can save it to an XML file and carry it to an actual deployment and publish it from there. Topology Builder is, you can install it on your Lync server, but you can install it again on an admin server that is outside. Again, the machine where you install the admin tools or the Topology Builder does not have to be configured in your topology. This is an outside tool. We have a planning tool. The planning tool is basically the only remaining component in Lync server that is not 64-bit. It's a 32-bit app. It's a web download, and it does not require core. It is designed to install on your notebook. You do a little bit of planning. You can export the topology or draft topology to Topology Builder, but it does not require any of our core components. Okay. Now my nice animation setup flow. So in the beginning there was AD, right? We had Active Directory deployed, and now we bring in one domain joined system. So again, here you can choose your first front-end server. You don't have to, right? This is it's up to you. We run the AD setup. Here the AD setup is something that we use our PowerShell commandlets to do that. And yes, you can go to your domain controller or to your schema master and can run this from there and then go back to your front end and continue the setup. Keep in mind, if you want to do that if we do run this, we will install, you need PowerShell on your domain controller, and we will install our core components for that. A lot of AD admins don't like it, so the other option for you is to do that from a remote machine, another server basically, where you have the AD tools installed, where you have basically the ability to compile the schema. And so you can run this domain controller or on a domain joined machine. Next step is you would install your Topology Builder, for example, on the same machine, or it can be a different machine. And in this case, let's install it on the same machine. You can bring in from Planning Tool a draft topology, or you can just author your topology fresh within Topology Builder. Once your topology is authored, you will go to a publish mode. In the publish mode, we now go after your SQL backend. And again, the SQL backend, if the first pool is a standard edition, this SQL instance is SQL Express that you can install via an extra button from our splash screen. There's a couple of things that can go wrong here. So for example, if you pick a machine, install SQL Express on this machine, then you go to your Topology Builder and set up a different machine, then obviously it will not find SQL Express over there. It needs to kind of map up. You need to designate your machine correctly. We will tell you if we can't find the SQL Express, and we also don't need to do that for subsequent standard edition servers that are deployed after the initial deployment is done. We don't need that. Yes, you can do it. It doesn't hurt because we will install SQL Express anyway. But so this is kind of the bootstrapping part. This is the reason why I'm kind of dwelling on this one is that it's an odd option in our menu, and a lot of folks kind of say, what does it makes no sense to me? What does it mean? And so that is a bit of a, that's why I kind of try to explain. Okay, in the next step, we publish the topology. And what happens here is we run a commandlet, we take the XML file, and we write it into the SQL database. If the SQL is not set up, we will run through a visit to set up the SQL for you. The user that runs the publish would have to be a database admin to be able to create those database tables. If you cannot be a database admin, we have an offline process to create those database tables ahead of time. There's a commandlet, it's called install CS database, that allows you to create the initial database. That is in case where your Lync admin is not your database admin specifically, and you need to delegate that to a different admin. Okay, once this is done, now what happens at this point in time? We have published the topology document to the SQL database. We created a service connection point in Active Directory. Now what happens is we go to our first Lync server system, and here it should be the front end, one of the first front ends that you deploy. Yes, you can do an edge as well, but you can deploy any other machine as well. But we recommend to start with the front end because the first front end will also act as the central management server and will do push out the changes, the configuration changes. There's no real order required, but we recommend to do that first, the first front end. What we do here is we run the local setup. The local setup will install core, and it will allow you to click on an install or remove components. We will go to the first step, and we will retrieve the topology document. And here, what we do is our UI goes into the Active Directory, searches for this connection point, and will attempt to connect to the SQL database and pull the topology file down. On an edge, for the first time, you will not be able to do that because your edge lives in the perimeter network, is not AD joined typically. You will not see this. So what our setup then will prompt you for, it says, hey, I can't connect, I can't see it. Give me a file. And at this point in time, you typically have a USB thumb drive with the topology that you exported previously from the topology builder machine, for example. You plug it in the first time, you read it from that file. It will deploy from there, and afterwards, you will have replication in place. So we retrieve the topology from SQL. We install the components. Now, what we do is we will determine prerequisites, right? We say, okay, you are a front-end server, and you have monitoring, archiving deployed, something like that. We will check for prerequisites. And here we will, we look for IIS, we look for all the components. So we will also install an odd component, which is the Windows Media Runtime Foundation, which is required for a couple of our workloads. This is the text-to-speech and the response group. If we detect that we need this, we will automatically install this. This runtime component is a little bit nasty because it always requires a reboot. And so you can do that ahead of time. If you know already, geez, this is going to be a front end, and I'm going to use this component, you can install it ahead of time. It's command line only. This Windows Media Foundation runtime is part of the desktop experience, but do not install the desktop experience because it's way more than you need, and it also takes forever and 3 reboots to actually install that on a server, for those of you who have tried it. So either let setup do it, we prompt you for a reboot, it configures a little bit, and then you basically rerun setup, and we will continue to install the rest. Or look in our documentation, there's a very ugly command line to install this, basically, via command line, this component. You can't get around the reboot if you don't have it. Let's go back. So activation. So what the activation does here is basically we go out and set up the appropriate groups. We add the computer account to a group in Active Directory. We basically enable you to do function as a front end. And then we have to deal with the certificates. So there's no way you can get around that. We have to deal with the certificates, unfortunately. You can pre-provision certificates. We have some tools to do that. We're very flexible on our certificate visit to do that. We support non-exportable private key or exportable private key. We have a couple of permutations of things that we support. ideally use our certificate wizard to request and enroll. Then we put the right data into the subject name and into the subject alternate name to do that. You might come back later to this machine if you have to do certificate maintenance. So, for example, you want to refresh a certificate, you can use our setup tool or setup certificate wizard to do that. Now, so you probably haven't seen that on this side here. I want to go back, author another, perform a topology change. If you do a topology change here, then what happens is that, in a typical case, you add a machine, let's say, and yes, you have to go to this machine and run local setup. There are some instances, however, where a change requires you to go back into a previously installed machine and we need to run setup again. The obvious case here is that if you remove a component, we need to remove that and we need to run setup. There's a few items around the join URL configuration or simple URL configuration. The way we have implemented that is if you change your simple URL configuration, we have to go around to each front end and your whole deployment, and we have to reconfigure the IIS rewrite rules. And we can't do that just by pushing out the topology change. Here, what we do is we take down the IIS config and bring it back up. And there's a couple of other changes, like changing the port on IIS. The main reason here is that our local setup will deal with all the firewall exceptions and does everything properly. So since this is not obvious to you where you have to run setup, we have in our topology wizard, the publish wizard, we have a little item that says, hey, go to these machines and run setup, basically. We try to compute what has changed, and then we will give you a notification, go to those machines and rerun setup. If you're unsure whether one machine needs to have this setup run, there's a commandlet called test.ts computer. You can go to this machine and run it, and it will basically tell you, hey, you have a pending setup, so go ahead and run setup on this machine. Okay, so I talked about add remove and some of the config changes. Now the deployment wizard here, the UI is, we highlight things in a specific way, things that are available right now. In this case, on a fresh deployment, we determined that Active Directory actually has not been run. So let's walk through the Active Directory process here. When we click on Active Directory, there's a step for prepare schema. There's a run button. There's a check mark once it's done. There is the manual step, which is verify replication of the schema partition. So here we have a couple manual steps for you to make sure that actually everything replicated if you have multiple domain controllers. So the way this works is we run a commandlet. And here is for the prepare schema. This is all printed out. At the end of it, there will be a log file at the bottom. We have the same for the prepare forest, where we set the ACLs. Again, it's a commandlet. And here, for the prepare domain, it's again one commandlet. It's relatively straightforward. Enable CS AD domain. There is a log file. If there are any problems, you can click in the log file. It's a web browser opens up, and you will have a rendering of the of this XML file. It's converted to an HTML file. Now, what you're seeing here, again, this is something which we have now made completely transparent in Lync Server 2010. It's all driven by commandlets. All our UI does actually is run commandlets under the hood. So you can run these commandlets separately. We have, for each commandlet, typically we have a set and get, or we have an install and get. So you can basically run here, say get CS AD server schema, and it will tell you, hey, it's ready for a Lync server, or it's not ready. The same with forest prep, the same with domain prep. You have basically the enable and the get the status. And we run those commandlets under the hood. So when you run the setup and go through the prepare Active Directory wizard, we run this under the hood just to see what the current state is, and then we populate the little check marks on the side. Okay, so let me switch over here to Topology Builder. So what I would like to do is I would like to run a demo about Topology Builder, and I will create a simple topology. So, and I want to cover a couple of things on this side here. So as I mentioned, this is only a notebook. I don't actually have the server, so I won't be able to fully publish. So what I'm doing is I start new topology. Topology Builder will prompt me for a file, which is essentially the save as that I would do otherwise when I exit a tool. We chose to put it ahead of time because there were a couple of glitches with you were able to kill our MMC without saving the file correctly. So we basically said, let's put it in the front so everybody is forced to enter a file name. This is a local file name. I should not put XML here because this is actually a TB-XML file. And so you see here, this is the file extension TB-XML. And this file is kind of a cache copy. If you fail to publish for whatever reason, this is where Topology Builder keeps a local config. So if you can, if your Topology publish fails for whatever reason, it's safe for you to close Topology Builder and reopen it. You will have all the data saved. Okay, so now what comes up is our create a new topology wizard. So you decide for a primary domain, contoso.com. Okay, I get this. All right, contoso.com. We add one additional zip domain just to demonstrate. Fabricam.com. I add this here. I have two zip domains now. Now I'll get prompted for my first site. It's kind of like Active Directory, but it's not an Active Directory site. This is our Lync server sites. Very important. This is completely orthogonal to any Active Directory sites. Let's say Redmond, and this is my main data center. And I hit next. Now I have optional fields. These are not used. Other for some properties on this. Redmond. This is in Washington. And this is in the US. And now what we created here right now is we created a zip domain. We created a name of the first site. The first site is just a name. It's an ID. So it could be a physical location, or it could be a logical part. If you have a data center, there's the same location, and you have multiple partitions on it. It is just a name. It has nothing to do with Active Directory sites. And it can be changed later without actually affecting your deployment. Okay, now I left this checkmark, the checkbox checked. Now we will open up into a new front-end pool. The front-end pool is the first thing that you need to deploy because we need our central management store and central management server to establish that, and this lives on the first front-end pool. So we go through the wizard. And we get you to the first question that we ask you is like, hey, is it an enterprise edition or is it a standard edition? So again, the standard edition is a single machine, no HA. Your database is co-located, and it's a SQL Express database. Enterprise edition, you can have one or more front ends, at least one, and you have your SQL database. It needs to be separate on a separate machine. It is a separate backend. So, for example, I call this eepool1.contoso.com. And that's my pool FQDN. Make sure that you get this right, because we don't support a rename of this FQDN. And it's a bit awkward, but basically what you would have to do is you would have to actually delete it. We need to deregister everything correctly, and then you have to recreate it with the new name. This is a bit of a feature. It's not, we're overly restrictive on this one, actually. We're hiding. There were some corner cases in which you can make some very nasty problems. Primarily, the reason why we have there is that if you have a machine FQDN, you can't promote it to a pool FQDN because we can't take this machine out in one and move it to a pool, or we can't move machines from one pool to the other in one move. If you have to do that, you need to delete it here, publish, edit here, publish again. So this is a bit of some awkwardness that we have in our deployment process, and the topology builder basically prevents it from doing that. It is smart, however, that it knows if it hasn't been published, you can go ahead and change it, but once it is published, it will tell you, hey, wait a minute, it's published, don't change it anymore. Okay, the Now let's create at least two fe1 dot, let's make this shorter, fe1.contoso.com, and my second front end is fe2.contoso.com. Add this as well. Next. Now my core page here, what are the features that I would like to have? So I have instant message and presence is always there. Now I can say, all right, I want to do conferencing that includes audio, video, application sharing. It does not include PSTN access. It does not include PSTN dial-in. So if you want to do the PSTN dial-in, you need to select this separately. Under the hood, what we configure is we know that we need a mediation server someplace, and we will also prompt you to deploy PSTN gateways. Enterprise voice. Enterprise voice is a bucket for us that basically means, yeah, I'm not only doing PSTN conferencing, but also deploy a full enterprise voice with a Lync, with a Lync server that does basically full PSTN external egress and ingress and ingress. Geez. And the enterprise voice switch deploys response group service. This is our kind of hunt group equivalent. And it also deploys a call park service, which allows you to put a call into an orbit for the agent to pick it up. Lastly, we have a call admission control. Call admission control is an optional feature that basically means if you have two data center sites that are connected via WAN, you can define a policy that you only use up a specific amount of bandwidth on the WAN. And we have a fallback if you peak out on this, the allocated amount of data, we would either prevent the call, or we will reroute to PSTN. So in my demo, I'll just uncheck this here right now. This is once this is deployed, it's not sufficient to just deploy that, but you would need to create networks and policies and define policies to enable this. Now, collocated server rules. So by default, we don't collocate the AV conferencing service. The AV conferencing service is our multi-point unit for audio and video. And this is, if you have a large deployment with over 10,000 users, we recommend to put this on a separate server. It's very CPU sensitive. And there's a lot of I/O that happens on this one. In my demo, I just collocated. I can go ahead and do that. If you can do the same. If you feel that there are performance issues, you can later decide to just uncollocate it and basically put it on a standalone server. And you can move back as well, so you have both ways. I choose to collocate my mediation server as well. There also another option is to put it on a separate server. There's a couple of scenarios in which you want to do that, but for the most part, you can collocate that. I'm asking here, I get asked a couple of questions about archiving, monitoring, edge. None of these are defined yet, so I will not select them yet. This is typically more useful if you have them already in your deployment and you can just click and associate them. If I were to click them here right now, I would get prompted to enter an archiving server. So and then our wizard would basically cascade out into multiple wizards, multiple flows. SQL. So I don't have a SQL store yet, so I'll just pick one, sql1.contoso.com. I give it a named instance, ls or Lync server. And on my file share, I don't have a file share. I have a file server1.contoso.com, and my file share is called ls share. Okay? Now I'm getting asked for my web services URL. So the first item here is the override internal web services pool of QDN. Since this is a enterprise edition pool, we're using DNS load balancing. We need to override this and set it a separate web internal FQDN. And the reason here is that the web needs to land on a hardware load balancer. It cannot land on the zip pool FQDN because the way it works is that the IP addresses on the website, we would not be able to load balance that. So we basically had to go down that route that we say, yeah, you need to override it, put another FQDN in there, and this FQDN resolves to the VIP of the hardware load balancer. If you're using a hardware load balancer for SIP and for HTTP traffic, you can keep it the same. It would go through. You would be able to use the same VIP, of course, with multiple rules on your hardware load balancer. So this is, if you're not totally sure what this is about, don't worry. We have a good documentation of in the planning guide about that spells that out in detail and what are the specific reasons are. I recommend to you, though, that you understand what is needed here, because if you want to change it later, you can change it, but it would have a certificate impact. So you might have to re-enroll your certificates, which is a bit of a pain. So try to get this right the first time. That is recommended. So call this webint1.contoso.com. On external here, I typically always have an override because that is published in my public, it's a public DNS entry. And so typically, you have something like server.corp.contoso.com, and on your public side, you have only one zone, let's say contoso.com as your public DNS zone, and that would be your public web FQDN. Again, this is, take a look at it in our planning doc. It goes into detail why we need that. Try to get it right the first time. Again, you can change it, but if you change it here, you will have a certificate impact, and you would have to go out to your public cert provider and re-request a certificate, which costs money. So make sure that you got this right the first time. This is not user-facing, so you can, it could be an ugly name here. Now, since I deployed PSTN conferencing and enterprise voice, I get prompted for PSTN gateways. I can actually skip over here right now, which I'm going to do. Of course, no routing is possible right now, but the topology is valid without PSTN gateways. And the reason why we made that choice is that we figured that a lot of guys, they just want to bring up the first pool, wire everything up, but they don't know necessarily the IP addresses or the FQDNs of the PSTN gateways. So you can come later in here and associate it with them. The other way around, a standalone PSTN gateway is not possible in Topology Builder. When you add one, you must associate them, and I can show you how this looks in a moment. Okay, so we're done now. We have our first deployment. We have an Enterprise Edition pool with 2 front-end servers. We have a conferencing that is co-located on the same pool. You see these are the same FQDN. We have a SQL store. We have a file store. We have one mediation pool, and we don't have any PSTN gateway. Now, let me just show you here by adding a new PSTN gateway. PSTN1.contoso.com. It could be an IP address. We ask you whether it's TCP or TLS. And we have a listening port on your, the SIP listening port on your PSTN gateway. Now, so I've added this, and what you see here up in the corner, you see this little red X. That means, hey, it's invalid. The reason is that this guy is not associated with a front-end pool. So let me just go ahead and do that. I'll go to my front-end pool. Here, I can go either here in the edit properties, or I can go over on these edit properties, and I launch my property page, and I'm scrolling down to my mediation server, and I will associate that here. No, add. I will click add. This is from a list of available PSTN gateways, and I add this and assign it to this site. Click OK. And now also my validation now is successful, and this PSTN gateway is enabled. You also see here on the general page, you see here the settings, the features and functionalities, conferencing, enterprise voice is enabled. You see our associations, SQL file store, archiving, monitoring, edge. I have a couple of other things, resiliency settings. We have web services settings. So again, by default, you see there's the ports are kind of the defaults. You can go ahead and change them. It's not part of the main visit, since we typically don't think that you change them. We have another bucket on conferencing, and we have mediation server. The other thing I would like to mention here, if you go in here on our AV conferencing pool, it will basically, hey, tell you, hey, this is, you can't edit here. This is go to your main page. Here also for the mediation server. We will see, no, sorry, for the mediation server, we show you that, not for the conferencing pool. Okay, so at this point in time, what you would do now is you would basically hit publish. And now the publish wizard would show up. And it, on my super high performance notebook, it takes a moment. It will basically run you through the wizard, creating the SQL configuration would show up. And if I hit next here, for example, it would tell you, hey, you got SQL to set up. You have a couple of things to do. And eventually it would publish, which I can't present here right now because of the lack of the server on the back end here. Okay, so I have to quickly hand over to Robert. And then after Robert is done, we'll do question and answers and a wrap-up. And as usual, I talk too much, so...
That's okay. We'll get in what we can. Hi, I'm Robert Fleming, and I'm the migration PM for Lync Server 2010. How many of you are currently running OCS, or whether it's 2007 or 2007 R2? Okay, it's about half the room. All right, good. That means this will be relevant. To start, I just want to cover an overview of what we prioritized when we thought about migration. First and top of first priority for all the customers we talked to service continuity. And so we put that on top of our list for what we needed to deliver in migration. One very sensitive area is the actual end user impact. So it wasn't enough to just have the servers be available, but we also needed to see very little end user impact. After we solved these two problems, we then focused on minimizing the overall hardware costs and then minimizing the TCO overall for migration. So our approach here is to deploy the servers first and deploy the clients last. You're going to deploy your servers side by side. You're going to have your OCS 2007 or OCS 2007 R2 server sitting right next to your 2010 server. And then you're going to pilot the pool to start. Basically, you're going to build up your confidence that you've done the right thing as an administrator, and then you're going to get feedback from your trial users to make sure that their experience is what you expect. What you're looking for in that feedback from your trial users is, is the new experience for Lync Server 2010 what they expect? And if they don't, you can gear up on your help desk or in your training to get your organization ready for migration. So I have a workflow. Effectively, what you're going to do with the workflow is you're going to start with your federated edge. Federated site. That is your site that has a federated edge. And then you're going to go through each of the pools in that site, and you're going to migrate those pools gradually. For sake of time, I'm going to hop ahead. This might be faster. So one point here is that the 2007 R2 deployment is federated edge first. The 2007 deployment is federated edge last. The reason being is that we aren't media compatible with the 2007 edge, so you need to stand up an entire stack when you deploy 2007. So rather than talking about it in slides, let me show a quick demo of the 3 steps that are involved in migration. Given Peter's already walked you through Topology Builder, here's another instance of it. I actually have this one on a live topology. Here we have an action. Oops, sorry for the drawing. Merge CS topology. And what this will do is actually take the 80 entries that are your old topology and actually insert them into CMS. What that allows you to do is from Topology Builder and from the other tools that we have in manageability, you can actually interleave the 2 servers. So to walk through this deployment wizard quickly, we have a welcome dialog. If you had a legacy edge that you wanted to integrate this, you'd do that here. For simplicity's sake, I'll skip that for this demo. And then you get to a similar point that Peter made, which was all of our UI runs on top of commandlets. It happens to be that it's easier from customer feedback to run merge within the context of Topology Builder, so we've put this action here. You can also run it offline via PowerShell if you want. This warning is just because of the demo topology, so we're not worried about it. I have a couple of warnings that you can go fetch if you need to. The point that Peter made is, earlier he talked about the backcompat site. So here we have the backcompat site as it shows up in CMS. So you actually have two instances. You have one inside of AD so that we get the right references when you activate 2010 into AD. And then here we have the old 2007 and 2007 R2 references that we're now adding to CMS so that they're mutually linked. So a quick publish. The server should be a little bit more performant than Peter's laptop. Again, we're running commandlets on top of this, so this is actually going to report out the commandlets as it runs. One of the features that Peter talked about earlier is that with the CMS model, we're actually able to model check what you've added, and we won't let you publish if you've described something that would otherwise break. So it's completed now. We hit finish, and this will enable me to run the next part of the demo. So that's the first stage of migration. The next is configuration. So now that we have the topologies merged, you now need to take your configuration that was in your old 2007 or 2007 R2 AD, and you need to get that configuration into CMS so we can use it during your user move. And that's a very simple compatlet. Import CS legacy configuration just goes into the AD and copies it over. It is a copy, so you can now diverge your two sources. This just gives you a schema warning on that we have a token in the string that we can't support in 2010. It's now published, and now I can go into the Lync server control panel, which you can see tomorrow in the more in action in the manageability session that we have. So here we have the external user access. If I hit refresh, you can see that we've actually pulled in some new settings for external user access. Now, what's interesting here is this is the one case that we do a translation. We've changed the way that we represent external user access from 80 to Lync server 2010, and by doing that, we actually permute the older values. So that's the end of the demo for import configuration, and the last part of the demo is actually moving a user. So you can do move user both from the control panel, which we'd probably do during a trial. You just need to move a few users, a few hundred, because the max view on the users in the control panel is a couple hundred. Or if you need to do it in batch, we also have this back by commandlet. Again, the philosophy of having PowerShell first and then putting you on top. So to move a user, you simply click on the user you want to move, and then come down to the menu to move selected user. It'll prompt you for a pool. In this topology, the new pool has 2010 in the title. Just hit OK. It runs. It actually runs the process in the background, again, running the commandlets for move user. And then if I hit find, we'll find that the user is no longer there. So if I then switch this filter off, hit find again, and we'll see that Tony Romano is actually moved to the new deployment. This actually works in reverse. So if you move the wrong user or you had a user that complained about it, you can actually move the user back, move back to the 2007 pool. It's going to give you a warning up the top that says you can have data loss. And that basically says that if you did anything specific to 2010, present settings or something like that, that's going to get lost when you move back. So if I hit this refresh again, now Tony's gone here, add the filter back, just to show it works. You can see user, find again, and Tony's back. So that's the quick 3 steps of migration. You have to merge the topology, you have to import the configuration, and you have to move your users. We have 2 docs on the web for migration. They're relatively large. They're 100-plus pages. They'll walk you through the process step by step. They put these particular migration steps in sequence with the deployment that Peter's already shown you so that you can see it on an end-to-end basis. It'll also talk about your secondary servers in OCS. For example, your CWA server, if you need to move that, your 2007 R2 doc and your 2007 doc will actually explain how to move that. And with that, let's go ahead and wrap up. Want to come on up, Peter?
Okay, thank you. So actually, since we are already pretty much out of time, I just wanted to go over those 2 slides. Sorry, I actually need to go backward, and that is holding this correctly. Database setup. Take a look at the install CS database commandlet. It has a couple of special scenarios. For the Kerberos authentication, also take a look at our documentation. We have commandlets for that.
Sorry.
That was him. Okay, the takeaways. The takeaways, we have platforms, prerequisites, configuration store, deployment tools, overview of coexistence migration. Now I have a couple of final giveaways. So first of all, I wanted to raise hands if you have more than one survivable branch appliance deployed. Let's see.
Any?
Who?
Oh, I see someone over there.
How many do you have? 4? Anybody more than 4 SBAs out there? All right, we got a winner.
This one?
Here we go. Yes.
Did you raise your hand again? All right, here I come.
Okay, so now I want to hear who has the smallest Lync server deployment on premise.
Thank you.
No, I mean, so we actually real users, not in your basement or something like that. So, so how many? 25. Who has less than 25? 5. That doesn't count. Okay, here the gentleman with the 5 users. All right, because who do you talk to when you have only 1 user, right? Okay, and I have a special giveaway for the one individual that is absolutely in every single session that I've ever made. And regardless where I go in a Microsoft campus, Lee is always there. He is always there, and you get the special prize, which is bacon-flavored chopstick. Thanks. He's the man. He's also our MVP. Okay. All right. So I want to open to any questions. I know this is kind of late. Please see us in the front. Thank you.